Based on true events, the film introduces us to Susan Chajalin, a 21-year-old woman who one day wakes up tied to a hospital bed due to a mysterious illness that the doctors cannot diagnose. To get to the truth of the matter, we have to go back a month when Susan was living her dream life as a reporter for the New York Post, hoping to help citizens by telling their stories. During that time, she received a message from her boyfriend, Stephen, and despite the fact that they had only just started dating, she could not hide her excitement. Her colleague, Margot, began teasing her about it. After work, Susan took her boyfriend to her home for the first time, not only to celebrate his birthday, but also so he could meet her parents, Tom and Rona, who had divorced some time ago and now each had new partners. As awkward as it might sound, the celebration unfolded without problems until it was time to blow out the candles. At that moment, Susan froze and seemed to be out of breath. After a few seconds in that state, Susan snapped back to reality but was unable to blow out the candles. That night, she went to a bar to watch Stephen sing, since he's a musician. The next day, after spending the night with her boyfriend, Susan arrived at work in a great mood, and Margot quickly deduced they had been intimate. Then her boss, Richard, assigned her an important interview with a senator. However, Susan again felt dizzy. Fortunately, she recovered quickly because Richard was offering her a unique opportunity to grow as a reporter. Since Margot had spoken well of her to secure that interview, Susan went to thank her, although she suffered a coughing fit. Susan couldn't escape her symptoms even at home, where she heard strange beeps and voices clearly not real. The next day, her situation worsened. She suffered from insomnia and discovered strange marks on her body. But when she tried to show them to Margot, he said he could see absolutely nothing unusual. Then Susan was summoned by Richard, who scolded her for turning in an article days late and not even doing it well. It dawned on Susan that she had lost track of time. While Richard kept reprimanding her, she froze, watching as her perception began to distort until he clapped his hands to snap her back to reality. The following morning, Susan barely managed to wake up in time for a creative meeting with reporters. There, Richard asked if she had already arranged the interview with the senator, so she pretended everything was set. After another coughing fit, Susan hid under her desk to call her boyfriend, telling him she had never felt so ill. Stephen worried she might be pregnant, a comment that didn't help at all. Finally, Susan decided to see a doctor, who told her everything seemed fine but performed an MRI for confirmation. Back home, she continued losing her grip on reality, hearing incessant dripping sounds from far away. Furious, she started yelling at the kitchen faucet to "Shut up!" Shortly afterward, the doctor called to say he found nothing alarming on the MRI, even though Susan felt otherwise. Still hearing the dripping noise, she asked her father to come fix it. Once he arrived, Tom was shocked to see her apartment in total disarray and reminded her that she was an adult now. However, he found no leak or any malfunction. The next day, Susan went to the office as if nothing was wrong, forgetting entirely about the senator interview. With no preparation, she had to conduct the interview on the spot, but her mental state and nerves caused her to laugh at the senator's answers. When he threatened to leave, Susan stood up frantically to stop him, but collapsed from dizziness. This earned her a massive scolding from Richard, who was angry that her failure would bring many problems to the newspaper and said he ought to fire her. Still, Richard instructed Margot to keep an eye on Susan, warning that if she kept this up, she would have to work from home. Meanwhile, Susan fell asleep at her desk, and when she woke, the entire office was empty. Back at home, Susan couldn't sleep and ended up having a seizure. If not for her boyfriend sleeping beside her, the outcome might have been fatal. After a hospital visit, Susan was joined by her parents. Tom complained about Stephen not calling them immediately when she had the seizure. Rona decided to take Susan home for a few days. However, the change of scenery didn't help. Her mother found her swimming in the pool as if in a trance. While discussing possible treatments at the table, Susan started pointing fingers at everyone, from Richard to Stephen. Suddenly, she mentioned she should go back to school to heal, then blame the city itself. No sooner had she exclaimed that she was unhappy everywhere than she suffered another sudden seizure. Following another checkup, the doctor claimed she was a young alcoholic who worked too much, making her condition seem normal. Rona was not satisfied with that explanation, feeling her daughter's pain acutely. The next day on the way to work, Susan stopped in a public restroom where her reflection in the mirror vanished. When she arrived at the office, she erupted in anger, declaring she didn't love her job anymore and was losing herself. Yet within seconds, her mood shifted to happiness, so much so that she jumped onto desks, asking Richard for a more demanding position. He decided to send her home. At home, Susan inexplicably began focusing on her stepfather. She even snuck into his bedroom at night to watch him sleep. During her treatments, she saw a psychologist who said she might have bipolar disorder. However, he reminded her that it was too soon for a definitive diagnosis, especially since she had declared herself bipolar solely based on information she found on Google. He ended up prescribing special pills, but not even 24 hours had passed before Susan claimed this new medication was causing her condition. Her mother insisted she continue taking them. After Susan complied, she mentioned that when she dies, she wants to be buried next to her grandmother. Feeling overwhelmed, Rona asked Tom to care for Susan for a few days. On Susan's very first breakfast at her father's home, she imagined her stepmother calling her spoiled. Of course, that didn't actually happen, but Susan furiously stood up from the table to confront her. Tom tried to calm her down, but Susan panicked and shouted that he was trying to kidnap her. In the end, she ran to her room in terror, leaving her father in tears alongside his wife. Now that both Tom and Rona had witnessed their daughter's illness firsthand, they met again with the doctor seeking answers, only to hear him say Susan was experiencing alcohol withdrawal. Neither parent accepted that theory and finally managed to get her hospitalized. Susan was treated by a new doctor, Ryan, whom she begged to turn off the TV because the voices were speaking ill of her. Even so, she continued hearing things and refused to follow the doctor's instructions. The only person who seemed to bring her back to reality was her boyfriend, Stephen, around whom she displayed the most stable version of herself, admitting she was scared of everything happening to her. Later, during a session with Dr. K, Susan insisted she needed to be released from the hospital because everyone was talking badly about her. Right after saying that, she abruptly left the session. Eventually, Susan snuck out of a mental health check to try to escape the hospital, but security guards caught her. That brings us to the opening scene, where Susan wakes up tied to a stretcher after a month of battling this mysterious illness. Since nothing seemed to work for Susan, Dr. Ryan mentioned to her parents the possibility of admitting her to a psychiatric hospital, which they firmly refused, demanding further investigation. Meanwhile, Stephen remained by Susan's side, dedicating songs to her that seemed to calm her. Because of this, he earned her parents' respect and gratitude for his unwavering support during such a difficult time. After many days of testing, seizures, and pressure from her parents to get the doctors to uncover the truth, Susan received a visit from Margot, who brought her a card signed by her colleagues at work, wishing her strength. However, Susan gave no response, bringing Margot to tears. Elsewhere, her parents met with the primary doctors on the case, who insisted Susan should be admitted to a psychiatric facility. The only concession Dr. Ryan gave them was 30 more days to continue investigating, which did little to curb Tom's anger, as he couldn't understand why they still hadn't found any answers, while his daughter kept suffering. When the doctors returned to Susan's room, they found her in a completely catatonic state. Remembering that her job as a doctor was to give people hope, Dr. K went to see Dr. Suhail Najar, a retired neurologist now teaching at a university. Susan's case was so compelling that he decided to make an exception and take it on. Even though Susan was catatonic, he managed to get her to move her hand while he conducted his evaluations. Tom found Stephen waiting in the hallway. Since Stephen still called him Sir, Tom asked him to just use his first name and embraced him in thanks for his support. Back with Susan, Dr. Najar tried to make her walk by following instructions, but when that failed, he asked her to draw a clock with the numbers 1 through 12. She managed to do it, but she filled in only the right side of the clock face. After thoroughly pondering the result, Dr. Najar finally formed a hypothesis. The right hemisphere of Susan's brain was severely damaged and inflamed, which explained why her perception was so distorted. The good news was that no psychiatric patient would have drawn the clock as she did, so they could rule out bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. Now they needed to focus on finding the cause of the inflammation. Dr. Najar suggested a brain biopsy, taking a sample of her brain tissue for analysis, which Tom thought was too invasive. But Dr. Najar insisted that if it were his own daughter, he would not hesitate to do it. After the surgery, Dr. Najar revealed that Susan had anti-NMDA receptor encephalitis. In simpler words, her brain was on fire and under attack by her own body. The good news was that there was a treatment, and if all went well, Susan would recover 90% of her cognitive abilities. After the family expressed their gratitude, the doctor leaned in and whispered to Susan that he had finally managed to find her within her own unconsciousness. Over time, Susan returned home and continued her treatment. Even though she was much improved, she couldn't help but wonder how many people throughout history had been labeled as crazy because doctors couldn't find an explanation for their conditions. Part of Susan's recovery involved relearning how to speak, walk, write. In general, relearning how to live. Fortunately, she had the full support of her parents and Stephen. 7 months later, we see Susan back at the New York Post as a reporter. Richard asked her to write a story about her illness to help other patients. While Susan worked at her desk, Margot kept poking her head in, asking if she was okay. Fortunately for everyone, Susan was better than ever, ready to write her own story, one that could be key to saving countless lives. In the epilogue, we learn that Susan was the 217th person to be diagnosed with anti-NMDA receptor encephalitis. Since then, thousands more have received the same diagnosis. Thanks to her book, Brain on Fire, thousands of doctors worldwide have found an explanation for similar patients. Meanwhile, Dr. Najar gained much more fame after Susan's case and opened a clinic specializing in mental disorders. He and Susan remain great friends. Beyond achieving new milestones in her professional career, Susan married her favorite musician, Stephen.
If you want interesting movie recaps, like, share, and subscribe to follow us for more movie recaps.